Okay, the reading for this week is the next part in our series on Chinese, on ancient or classical Chinese civilization and culture and philosophy and so forth. The reading is selections from Mozi's Disposing of Error, or Lihuolun in the original Chinese title. And as once again, this excerpt from the essay is taken from William Theodore DeBarry and Irene Bloom's Sources of Chinese Tradition, Volume 1. I'll put the link to that important work of scholarship in the description to this video below. You can purchase the book and follow along as you listen to this this recitation and commentary. And the PDF worksheets that I'm using in this class were compiled by somebody at Columbia University. I'll put the link to that below in the description as well. Okay, so Mozi's Disposing of Error. The Indian religion of Buddhism, so remember Buddhism begins in India with Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. The Indian religion of Buddhism began to enter China via trade routes during the later years of the Eastern Han Dynasty, so between 25 AD and 220 AD. All right, remember that the Han Dynasty spans from around 200 BC to around 200 AD. So this is the second half of the Han Dynasty when Buddhism comes to China. The teachings and practices of Buddhism were quite different from those of Chinese civilization and contrasted with the teachings of the Confucian and Taoist philosophers whom the Chinese held in high regard. Although I should note that there are more overlaps between Buddhism and Taoism than there are between Buddhism and Confucianism. Nonetheless, Buddhism appealed to enough people to pose a challenge to those who disapproved of or had doubts about the new religion. Those doubts are addressed in this essay, constructed as a conversation between Mozi and a critic of Buddhism. So Mozi, the author of this work, of this essay, who may have been the author of this essay, was originally a Confucian scholar and official. Okay, disturbed by the chaotic atmosphere of the later years of the Eastern Han, Mozi retreated to his home in the southwestern Guangxi province to study Buddhism and Taoism. And there he more or less converted to Buddhism, I think. In this essay, he responds to the critics of Buddhism. Okay, so I'll put some more information about Mozi in the description below this video. I'll link to some reliable sources about Mozi so we can read more about him before discussing this essay in class. Okay, as always in the worksheet that you have, there's a short version and a longer version. I'm going to read the longer version, but before I read that, I'm going to read the 5 study questions that we will discuss in class. Question number 1. What strategies does Mozi use to respond to charges that Buddhism contradicts the moral principles and ways of living set forth by Confucianism? So how does he respond to the Confucian critique of Buddhism? Question 2. Could a person defending Islam against the critiques of Christians, or a person defending Christianity against the criticism of a Muslim, use similar strategies to those used by Mozi in this essay? Why or not? Why not? So, in other words, can Mozi's framework for defending Buddhism be used to defend any religion, or is his method of defense particular to Buddhist issues? Discuss. Question number 3. Does Mozi reject Confucianism and Taoism? Or does he seek for some kind of reconciliation between all these competing strands of thought? Question 4. Are Mozi's arguments convincing? Why or why not? Okay, are you convinced by it? This will depend, of course, on how sympathetic you are to Buddhism as a religion and philosophy. And question 5. How might a Confucian or a Taoist respond to Mozi's arguments? So imagine, we can do this as an assignment. After we finish discussing the work, we can imagine that you are a Confucian or a Taoist and are going to mount a response to, or put forth a response to Mozi's arguments, and you can write that out. All right, here is the selections from Mozi's Disposing of Error. Why is Buddhism not mentioned in the Chinese classics? Okay, so imagine somebody, an anti-Buddhist Confucian, asking him this question, and then he gives a response to it. So why is Buddhism not mentioned in the Chinese classics? In his response, the questioner said, if the way of the Buddha is the... Hold on a second. The questioner said, if the way of the Buddha is the greatest and the most venerable of ways, why did Yao, Shang, the Duke of Zhou, and Confucius not practice it? In the 7 classics, one sees no mention of it. And the 7 classics, there's a note here. There are several different lists of the 7 classics. One found in the History of Language includes one list included in the history of the latter Han includes the odes, so the shu, the documents, or the odes rather, sure, the documents, the shu, the rites, the li jing, the music, the yue, changes, the ai jing, spring and autumn annals, the qiu qiu, and the Analects, Lung Yu of Confucius, is one list. All right. I'm not going to read all the footnotes, and we'll get bogged down in those. In the 7 classics, one sees no mention of Buddhism. You, sir, are fond of the classics and odes and the classic of documents, and you take pleasure in the rites, the Li Jing, and in music, Yue. Why then do you love the way of the Buddha and rejoice in outlandish arts? Can they exceed the classics and commentaries and beautify the accomplishments of the sages? Permit me the liberty, sir, of advising you to reject them. Okay, it's the question that he imagined somebody asking him, and then Mozi responds by saying, Mozi said, quote, all written works need not necessarily be the words of Confucius, and all medicine does not necessarily consist of the formula of Bian Que. See footnotes 2 above, 1 above. Alright, we'll go over who Bian Cui is in class. What accords with rightness, Yi, is to be followed. What heals the sick is good. The gentleman scholar, the Shi, draws widely on all forms of good, and thereby benefits his character. Okay, so we need not restrict ourselves to one system of thought. We take in syncretically any system of thought that works and that is true, is what he's saying here. The gentleman scholar draws widely on all forms of good and thereby benefits his character. Zigong said, did the master have a permanent teacher? Yao served Yin Shou, Shun served Wu Cheng, the Duke of Zhou learned from Lu Wang, and Confucius learned from Lao Tzu. Okay, so these 2 thought systems traditionally thought of as antithetical, Confucianism and Taoism. In truth, Confucius actually learned from Lao Tzu, his point here. And none of these teachers is mentioned in the 7 classics. Although these 4 teachers were sages, to compare them to the Buddha would be like comparing a white deer to a unicorn or a swallow to a phoenix. Yao, Shang, the Duke of Zhou, and Confucius learned even from such teachers as these. How much less, then, may one reject the Buddha, whose distinguishing marks are extraordinary and whose superhuman powers know no bounds? How may one reject him and refuse to learn from him? The records and teachings of the 5 classics, the Wu Jing, do not contain everything. All right, so we must not fall into the trap of thinking that everything is contained in these series of works that we have deemed to be canonical. Even if the Buddha is not mentioned in them, what occasion is there for suspicion? The next question he asks, or he imagines somebody asking him, is why do Buddhist monks do injury to their bodies? And there's a note here. One of the greatest obstacles confronting early Chinese Buddhism was the aversion of Chinese society to the shaving of the head, which was required of all members of the Buddhist clergy. The Confucians held that the body is the gift of one's parents, and that to harm it is to be disrespectful to them. Okay, so the questioner said, the classic of filiality, the Xiao Jing, remember Xiao is the word for filiality, oyakoko no ko in Japanese. The classic of filiality says, our body, limbs, hair, and skin are all received from our fathers and mothers. We dare not injure them. When Zhengzi was about to die, he bared his hands and feet. But now the monks shave their head. How this violates the sayings of the sages and is out of keeping with the way of the filial. Okay, someone says, and to which Mao Zedong responds, Confucius has said, there are those with whom one can pursue the way, the Tao, but with whom one cannot weigh decisions. This way, like spelled differently, W-E-I-G-H. This is what is meant by doing what is best at the time. Furthermore, the classic of filiality, the Xiao Jing, says, the early kings ruled by surpassing virtue, De, and the essential way, Dao. Taibo cut his hair short and tattooed his body, thus following of his own accord the customs of Wu and Yue, and going against the spirit of the body, limbs, hair, and skin passage. And yet Confucius praised him, saying that his might well be called the ultimate virtue. Okay, so he's basically responding by saying that there are, in fact, precedents for people altering their physical appearance and so forth. Next question that he imagines somebody asking him is, why do monks not marry? And the note here says, another of the great obstacles confronting the early Chinese Buddhist church was clerical celibacy. One of the most important features of indigenous Chinese religion is devotion to ancestors. If there are no descendants to make the offerings, then there will be no sacrifices. To this is added the natural desire for progeny. Traditionally, there could be no greater calamity for a Chinese than childlessness. So how should the traditional Chinese people react to this fact of celibacy that is required among the Buddhist clergy? And Mozi writes, imagining a questioner asking him, the questioner said, now of felicities there is none greater than the continuation of one's line. Of unfilial conduct there is none worse than childlessness. The monks forsake wife and children, reject property and wealth. Some do not marry all their lives. How opposed this conduct is to felicity and filiality. All right, some footnotes about this. We'll go over this in class. To which Mozi responds, wives, children, and property are the luxuries of the world. But simple living and doing nothing, Wu Wei, remember Wu Wei is an important term in Taoism, and doing nothing, also Confucianism as well. But simple living and doing nothing, Wu Wei, are the wonders of the way, the Tao. Lao Tzu has said, of reputation and life, which is dearer, of life and property, which is worth more. Shu You and Chao Fu dwelt in a tree. Bo Yi and Shu Qi starved in Shou Yang. But Confucius praised their worth, saying, they sought to act in accordance with humanity, and they succeeded in acting so. Remember, humanity is Ren. One does not hear of their being ill spoken of because they were childless and propertyless. The monk practices the Tao, the way, and substitutes that for the pleasures of disporting himself in the world. He accumulates goodness and wisdom in exchange for the joys of wife and children. Okay, so once again, he's saying that there are precedents for this kind of behavior before Buddhism came, namely within the context of Taoism. People have held similar ideals and responsibilities. Next is on death and rebirth. The note says, Chinese ancestor worship was premised on the belief that the souls of the deceased, if not fed, would suffer. Rationalistic Confucianism, while taking over and canonizing much of Chinese tradition, including the ancestral sacrifices, was skeptical about the existence of spirits and an afterlife apart from the continuance of family life. The Buddhists, though denying the existence of an immortal soul, accepted transmigration. Right? In Japanese we say rinne. And the early Chinese understood this to imply a belief in an individual soul that passed from one body to another until the attainment of enlightenment. The following passage must be understood in light of these conflicting and confusing interpretations. So the questioner said to Mao Zedong, the Buddhists say that after a man dies he will be reborn. I do not believe in the truth of these words. To which Mao Zedong responds, the spirit never perishes, only the body decays. The body is like the roots and leaves of the 5 grains. When the roots and leaves come forth, they inevitably die. But do the seeds and kernels perish? Only the body of one who has achieved the way perishes. So there's almost echoes of that famous passage in John from the New Testament there. When a seed falls, whoa, hold on. The wind just picked up. We have a storm coming in. Let me fix the file. Someone said, if one follows the way, one dies. If one does not follow the way, the Tao, one dies. What difference is there? To which Mozi responded, you are the sort of person who, having not had not a single day of goodness, yet seeks a lifetime of fame. If one has the way, the Tao, even if one dies, one's soul goes to an abode of happiness. If one does not have the way, the Tao, when one is dead, one's soul suffers misfortune. And the next set of questions is about why should a Chinese allow himself to be influenced by Indian ways, by foreign ways, which they tend to look down upon. The note says, this is one of the objections most frequently raised by Confucians and Taoists once Buddhism had acquired a foothold on Chinese soil. The Chinese apologists for Buddhism answered this objection in a variety of ways. Here we see one of the arguments used. So the questioner said, Confucius said the barbarians with a ruler are not so good as the Chinese without one. Mencius criticized Chen, Shang, for rejecting his own education to adopt the ways of the foreign teacher Xu Xing, saying, I have heard of using what is Chinese to change what is barbarian, but I have never heard of using what is barbarian to change what is Chinese. You, sir, at the age of 20, learned the way of Yao, Xu, remember the two legendary sage kings from antiquity, Yao and Xu, often mentioned it by Confucius. You, sir, at 20, learned the ways of Yao, Xun, Confucius, and the Duke of Zhou, but now you have rejected them and instead have taken up the arts of the barbarians. Is this not a great error? To which Mozi responded, what Confucius said was meant to rectify the way of the world, and what Mencius said was meant to deplore one-sidedness. Of old, when Confucius was thinking of taking residence among the 9 barbarian nations, he said, if a noble person dwells in their midst, what rudeness can there be among them? So wherever the civilized man goes, there is civilization, is basically what Confucius famously said, even if he goes into the barbarian regions. The commentary says, this is quite a brilliant response actually, the commentary says, the North Polar Star is in the center of heaven and to the north of man. From this, one can see that the land of China is not necessarily situated under the star of heaven, Tian. According to the Buddhist scriptures, above, below, and all around, all beings containing blood belonging to the Buddha clan. Therefore I revere and study these scriptures. Why should I reject the way of Yao, Xun, Confucius, and the Duke of Zhou? Gold and jade do not harm each other. Crystal and amber do not cheapen each other. So again, metaphors are being employed here. You say several jewels can exist simultaneously at once, is his point. You say that another is in error when it is you yourself who err. Pretty brilliant response there. Next set of questions. Does Buddhism have no recipe for immortality? So Taoism famously strives to achieve immortality. Within, the note here says, within the movement broadly known as Taoism, Daojiao, there were several tendencies. One, the quest for immortality, another, an attitude of superiority toward questions of life and death. The first Chinese who took to Buddhism did so out of a desire to achieve superhuman qualities, among them immortality. The questioner is disappointed to learn that Buddhism does not provide this after all. Mozi counters by saying that even in Taoism, if properly understood, there is no seeking after immortality. Okay, so the questioner that Mozi imagines asking him a question says, the questioner said, the Taoists say that Yao, Xun, the legendary sage kings, the Duke of Zhou, and Confucius, and his 22 disciples did not die, but became immortals. The Buddhists say that men must all die, and that none can escape death. What does this mean? To which Mozi responds, talk of immortality is superstitious and unfounded. So Mozi has a very modern, scientific, sort of rationalistic, naturalistic understanding of the human. And Buddhism, of course, is very, in some ways, compatible with that, if you get rid of all the sort of cosmology and talk of deities and so forth. Mozi said, talk of immortality is superstitious and unfounded. It is not the word of the sages. Lao Tzu said, even heaven and earth cannot last forever. How much less can human beings? End quote from Lao Tzu. Confucius said, quote, the wise man believes the world, but humaneness, ren, and filial piety shall last forever. I have looked into the 6 arts and examined the commentaries and records. According to them, Yao died. Xun had his place of burial at Mount Sangwu. Yu has his tomb on Kuaiji. Bo Yi and Shu Qi have their graves in Shouyang. King Wang died before he could chastise the tyrant Zhou. King Wu died without waiting for his son King Cheng to grow up. And of Yang Yuan, the master said, unfortunately he was short-lived, likening him to a bud that never bloomed. All of these things are clearly recorded in the classics, in the Wu Jing, the 5 classics. They are the absolute words of the sages. I make the classics, the Wu Jing, and the commentaries my authority and find my proof in the world of men. Okay, so reject superstition, and if you look to the classics, there's actually very little, if any, superstition and talk of immortality and so forth, and magic and so forth, is his point here. To speak of immortality, is this not a great error? All right, that's the end of this excellent essay. We will discuss more about it in class. That's all for now. Goodbye.